What do you think drives the tenacity of the devil? Never giving up. Well, it's fear. Fear drives the devil because he doesn't understand God's plan. He never had anything to be afraid of to begin with, and he still doesn't know that. Be that as it may, he must be stopped. Let's explore the history of Marxist strategies to bring America down.
The Frankfurt School developed the concept of cultural Marxism.
Penetrate the culture, take it over, and then everything else will follow.
And of course they did that, and today we've had a complete cultural revolution. As many people in America are familiar with the phrase "make love, not war," that actually came from Herbert Marcuse, who was with the Frankfurt School. So these guys went after education, they went for media, and they've been very successful in changing the entire worldview of Americans through what they call political correctness, but it's really cultural Marxism, with the goal being to destroy Christianity, then create chaos, and then move to their ultimate goal, which is from cultural Marxism to traditional Marxism, which is socialism.
So this idea is the idea that through changing a culture, we change the thinking of a nation.
Most of the strategy to remake America from within started with Antonio Gramsci, who wrote over 2,000 pages back in the 1930s outlining how to take a Judeo-Christian culture down from the inside. The plan he suggested has been the main focus of the left ever since.
Antonio Gramsci was a neo-Marxist philosopher.
Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist.
Antonio Gramsci is probably the biggest troublemaker in the world. He's probably got more responsibility for our social ills than anybody else on the planet.
He knew of the importance of undermining the morals in the character of this country.
Because America had a strong Christian heritage, you had to attack the culture. You had to change the culture.
Even to pornography, into areas that most people normally wouldn't accept.
He said we're going to destroy the West by destroying its culture. We're going to infiltrate and we're going to turn their music, their art, and their literature against them.
That means that you penetrate the universities, you write the books, the novels, the poetry, the music, the book reviews. And once you control the culture, then you can sort of shape the thought of rising generations.
Satan, through the political sphere, has been trying to prepare for a final or last days himself, wherein he can erect a perfected control of human beings. And he would then see America persisting to give people freedom, which they're not controlled. Well, America would be his enemy. Eventually, you can see the efforts that Satan is making in the real world to press towards his goals.
Protests. No, these were not protests. These were scenes from war. The rioters threw rocks, bottles, wood, explosives at police. One explosion left an 8-inch hole in a police precinct. Because no lie is too absurd for CNN to tell, the network described violence against police as, quote, a demonstration against police violence. Got that? It's a perfect inversion of the truth worthy of 1984. Ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery, war is peace.
Even moving towards those goals by force, trying to have the benefit of sort of looking like they're not being forceful. So if we look at one of the warnings of this totalitarian tiptoe and how it might ultimately end, was explored in the book 1984. Ingsoc, the fictitious nation based on English socialism. Ingsoc had a full control of the language of the people.
The central tenet of Ingsoc, the version of English socialism practiced in Oceania, is that the past is immutable, that it has no objective existence and exists only in written records and in human memories. Orwell writes, "The past is whatever the records and the memories agree upon, and since the party is in full control of all records and in equally full control of the minds of its members, it follows that the past is whatever the party chooses to make it." So Winston writes mainly in Newspeak, this version of English with grammar and vocabulary designed to narrow the range of thought. The idea is that without the language to express dissent, political crimes, both in thought and deed, will become impossible. So the party is manipulating a real structural feature of the human brain. As we learned in our discussion of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, what matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it.
Okay, so one of the tactics involving the full takeover of a nation is to clamp down on language so that people cannot fully conceive or feel safe to conceive of rebellion. Of course, we also know that in 1984, people were afraid of committing thought crimes, so language was controlled.
Ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery, war is peace. They repeat it because they expect you to believe it, and no doubt some do. The Seattle Police Department gamely tried to push back by releasing actual body cam footage of the violence. It's not clear how many people saw it, so we're going to show some of it to you right here. A total of 59 police officers were injured in this demonstration against police violence. CNN would like you to believe they attacked themselves. They did not. Not in Seattle, not anywhere. In Oakland, mobs with helmets and shields attacked a police station. They shot cops with fireworks. They set fire to a courthouse. Here are pictures of it. According to ABC News, the rioters you just saw were, quote, protesters. They burned the courthouse, quote, after a peaceful demonstration intensified. Oh, intensified. Just like the World Trade Center collapsed when a commercial airline flight intensified.
Protesters in California set fire to a courthouse, damaged a police station, and assaulted officers after a peaceful demonstration intensified. Peaceful demonstration intensified. Amazing work. Amazing. You see, ABC was reticent to say, ooh, are we going to use the riot word?
It's remarkable. You've got to believe there are still normal people working at ABC News, maybe in the tape library or in the cafeteria. Are they watching their own coverage? How can they stand it? The apologies for violence, the relentless, shameless lying. It's hard to believe they haven't resigned. They probably have mortgages and kids. You feel for them, just as you feel for the cameramen who had to flee the mob in Sacramento over the weekend. They were surrounded and apparently assaulted by 150 Joe Biden voters dressed in black paramilitary gear and had to run for their lives. You'd think other journalists would be sympathetic to this. They used to be, not anymore. The stakes are too high. We've got an election coming up. And so instead they lied to provide cover for the rioters, the ones who threatened the cameraman. The Sacramento Bee took pains to tell you that the protests were actually peaceful. The newspaper did its best to downplay the violence, including the fact that so-called protesters are trying to disarm police helicopters with laser pointers.
So, even when circumstances are not flattering to the regime or to the political party running the subversion, they change the language so as to give the air of victory, as if completely unfavorable circumstances were totally favorable for their cause, and as if totally favorable circumstances for their opponents were completely unfavorable. So Orwell even describes how we cope, knowing deep down in our bones that the totalitarians have given us a completely disgusting world through their deception and their doublespeak.
Orwell was also thinking about the relationship between instinct and language. Let's go to the thought bubble. The word instinct appears 31 times in 1984. Winston is a creature of instinct, and his strongest instinct is to survive. To hang on from day to day and from week to week, spinning out a present that had no future seemed an unconquerable instinct. Just as one's lungs will always draw the next breath so long as there is air available. Winston instinctively understands that his society is inhumane. It might be true that the average human being was better off now than they had been before the revolution. The only evidence to the contrary was the mute protest in your own bones, the instinctive feeling that the conditions you lived in were intolerable, and that at some other time they must have been different.
So Orwell eventually describes how this instinct towards the correction of this massive lie of the totalitarian is channeled by the totalitarian strategists. What they do is take an instinct, stuff it down, and only allow that instinct or that fury to be expressed in a strategic way that is, again, favorable to the regime.
For example, the party transforms an innate fear of death into mob violence. For how could the fear, the hatred, and the lunatic credulity which the party needed in its members be kept at the right pitch except by bottling down some powerful instinct and using it as a driving force? It also transforms the survival instinct into a form of self-repression. Crime Stop is the ability to cut off one's ideas as though by instinct at the threshold of any dangerous thought. Thanks, Thought Bubble. But of course, those thoughts are only dangerous because the government might kill you for having them.
Given the fact that the regime is showing hostility, although they're never admitting that they're actually being hostile while they're being hostile, how is it that individuals eventually join the regime? Well, if they don't, they get beheaded.
In the end, his consciousness cannot survive being threatened with having his head put in a cage filled with hungry rats. That is when Winston breaks down and wishes that Julia would receive this punishment in his place. And by betraying Julia, he loses his ability to love and loses faith in his own humanity. And then, after Winston has psychologically broken, he starts to think in Newspeak. I mean, consider this stream of non-conscious narrative. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime Stop, they called it in Newspeak.
In Orwell's 1984, Crime Stop was the matter of having a person censor himself as a result of basically the terrorism of the regime.
This was the largest single abuse of power in American history, in which Barack Obama and Joe Biden and their CIA director, their FBI director, their NSA director, their DNI director, their UN ambassador, and the rest of the high-level members of their administration, including many at the FBI.
Eventually, there's no way to resist gross overreaches into the personal portions of responsibility of every single citizen.
Abuse the full legal authority of the U.S. government and the extraordinary capability of our intelligence agencies for surveillance to spy on the Republican candidate for president, to defraud the FISA courts, to use documentation they knew was fraudulent in an illegal coup to undo the 2016 election. And that's not a speculation. That's not a conspiracy theory. We now have declassified documents, thanks to the heroic efforts of Rick Grenell, that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this whole thing was a political hit job.
We now live at a time where leftists are so encouraged, not recognizing the sleeping giant that is the silent majority in this country, not recognizing they have overstepped their bounds in multiple arenas. Another one relates to the blatant censorship of social media giants.
Zuckerberg told senators at the April 10th hearing that he understood concerns legislators had about conservative censorship because Silicon Valley is an extremely left-leaning place. He said he shared that concern, and it's something he tries to root out in the company. The next day, he responded to a question from Representative Steve Scalise by saying there was absolutely no directive to have a bias in anything we do. To the contrary, our goal is to be a platform for all ideas. Now that was a lie.
That's what he said in Congress when he was on the stand.
So responding. Well, here's the challenge though. Our goal. What does that even mean?
The goal, right?
Right. It doesn't mean they do it.
Rather loose.
Exactly. We can do whatever we want. My goal is to have $20 billion. During Veritas's undercover investigation, a Facebook content moderator said she would delete every Republican item that showed up on her queue. She added that she doesn't remove anti-Trump content even if it violates the policy. If someone is wearing a MAGA hat, I am going to delete them for terrorism, another moderator said. I think we are all doing that. Now, here's another snag. This, I believe, was a third-party company. Zuckerberg is going to say, Facebook didn't do anything. third-party company did.
Yeah.
At the time of the investigation's release, James O'Keefe, the founder of and CEO of Veritas, said the findings raised serious doubts about Zuckerberg's testimony on Capitol Hill. O'Keefe added the report called into question Facebook's immunity under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Gates wrote in the letter to Barr that the findings of the Project Veritas investigation were in direct contrast with Zuckerberg's testimony that Facebook was a politically neutral platform. Facebook's AI screening content is not politically neutral. Neither are the moderators hired to review content flagged by the AI program, Gates told Barr. This stands in opposition to Zuckerberg's congressional testimony and violates the good faith provision of Section 230C2A of the Communications Decency Act. The congressman asked Barr to investigate Zuckerberg for making materially false statements to Congress while testifying under oath and asked for full and proper consideration. First of all, Project Veritas, James O'Keefe, bravo, good sirs.
Black Lives Matter and Antifa represent carefully planned communist infiltration. The leaders of these organizations, some of them have openly said that they are trained Marxists, which means that all of the strategies discussed so far are common thought processes of these people. Another strategy is explained by this man, Yuri Bezmenov, who explains that in order to take down a larger, stronger country, you need certain judo principles.
You see, the tactic of subversion about which I'm talking is similar to the martial art, the Japanese martial art. If some of you are familiar with that tactic, probably you will remember that if an enemy is bigger and heavier than yourself, it would be very painful to resist his direct strike. If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. You see? So, what happens here? The target country obviously does something wrong. If it's a free democratic society, there are many different movements within the society. There obviously, in every society, there are people who are against this society. They may be simple criminals, ideologically in disagreement with the state policy, conscientious enemies, simply psychotic personalities who are against anything, right? And finally, there are a small group of agents of a foreign nation, bought, subverted, recruited, right? The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go.
There you go. So why doesn't it seem to be working?
Donald Trump is not the cause of these problems. He is a symptom of the greater culture war. People finally saying, enough. We're tired of the PC. We want someone who's different, an outsider, to change things. They voted for Donald Trump. Now he won by good margins in the Electoral College, but in some states by very thin margins. We'll see how things play out in November. But I think now people are starting to realize this is the doing of the Democrats who have ignored, supported, and even joined in the Black Lives Matter protests, which eventually became full-blown riots, and they still chose to ignore it all. In Oregon, downtown Portland businesses derailed by pandemic say protests present new challenge. That's right. As many people will say, it's not a big deal what's happening in Portland because it's only affecting a small 12-block radius. The whole city is fine. So what about the people trapped here? What about the businesses that work here? What about their lives? Do their lives not matter? Their lives do matter. And people don't want to go downtown anymore because of the constant violence and the protests and the riots. And they're telling us this. The Oregonian Live is no right-wing publication. In fact, it leans to the left.
The divine principle says, nonetheless, democracy born out of the French Revolution was a Kane-type democracy. Although it destroyed absolutism, it sought to firmly secure the Kane-type view of life. The leading thinkers behind the French Revolution were Enlightenment figures such as Denis Diderot and Jean Léron de Longueville, who adhered to atheism and materialism. Furthermore, despite its ideals of individual freedom and equality, the actual course of French democracy in the years of the Revolution and afterward tended towards totalitarianism. In this way, those espousing the Cain-type view of life championed the Enlightenment and gave rise to the French Revolution, thus establishing Cain-type democracy. It completely blocked the inclinations of the human spirit to seek for God. As it continued to develop, with its sole focus on external aspects of life, it would later be systematized into Marxism in Germany and Leninism in Russia, eventually forming the communist world. What that means in a nutshell, or what that suggests in a nutshell, is that cultural revolutions such as the French Revolution, which was powered by humanism, which eventually led to forms of materialism, drastic forms of materialism like communism, Marxism, and Leninism. What it refers to is that when we see that people are rejecting your language, rejecting the idea that Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa are, heroic in nature, how are you ever going to get to a strong implementation of Marxism if the cultural materialism hasn't taken root? You see, America has completely digested that trope, and that's why you don't realize it, but you're wasting your time.
Democrats like Joe Biden saying they are peaceful protests. Jerry Nadler saying Antifa violence in Portland is a quote myth. What are your thoughts on both of those issues?
We weren't here before federal officers were deployed, but certainly from people we've spoken to, these protests have been ongoing and really haven't showed a major sign of slowing down. By the time we got here, the courthouse was it's littered in graffiti. There's things on the street from fires being set and fireworks going off. And I saw that clip the other day of Jerry Nadler saying that, Antifa is a myth and the violence here in Portland is just a DC lie, essentially. And the videos we've taken all week kind of speak for themselves, and it's very clearly not the case, I think.
What do the rioters want? Do they want, defund the police? Do they want income inequality solved? I think you heard them chanting a certain chant. Can you tell us what they want and what will make them stop?
So we did hear them. One of the chants that I think stood out to me the most was they were saying they're not going to stop until all the precincts are burned to the ground. So this is an extreme attitude, and they want the federal officers out. But who knows, if the federal officers leave, will they leave the courthouse alone? I'm not sure. So they're angry at the federal officers. They're angry at the police officers. I think that they just want all of this defunded. They want the officers out of Portland. And night after night, we're seeing there's no slowing down.
So ultimately, what's messing up their strategy that they have the nerve to actually try to implement? What's messing them up is America is just too good for people to wrongly remember it. America cannot be reprogrammed by changing the history books because we love our history too much. It's inspiring to us. So the idea that America was racist from its inception and that's all that there is to America, well, we've experienced too much goodness by and large to actually believe that. And even though we feel that there's a clampdown on our speech, that doesn't mean that we've given up our minds, hence silent majority. So what do all these news stories have in common? Nobody's believing the Democrat narrative. It's too absurd. Democrats, you guys can't go out and be violent every night and just think by the power of media pretending that it's not happening, that it goes unseen. You've placed too much stock in that tactic. There's no way that it can yield everything that you wish it would yield. There's no way. There's no way. The reason why you guys have gone out on a limb like this is because it's your last-ditch effort before justice comes to some of your favorite figures. You've been planning this insurrection for maybe a few decades. And because justice is coming, you decided to unpack all your favorite tactics. But it was too soon. It was not fated to be. Anyway.